Have you seen pan like this? What about this? Okay, what about this one? What about this one? No, these pictures are from the illustrated story of Pan. Now, this is a wonderful book filled with pictures and personal accounts of the people who have been instrumental in the creation and development of Pan in its home country, Trinidad and Tobago. The book was written by Dr. Kim Johnson. Now, Dr. Kim Johnson is someone that I've been following throughout the years when it comes to the history of the steel pan. Now, he has written several books on the history and culture of Trinidad and Tobago, many of which focus on pan. I had the opportunity of interviewing Dr. Kim Johnson about the book and also about his thoughts on the future of pan. So in this video, I'm super excited to share the interview with you. And if you're interested in buying his book, I'll be including the link in the description below. Enjoy. Pleasant good night to everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ashley Murray, the musical director at the TropicalFete Steelpan Ensemble. It is Caribbean American Heritage Month, and if you've been following TropicalFete, you know every June in celebration we host the Authors Connecting series. This is a cultural program that features Caribbean authors and is designed to emphasize the importance of literacy and how culture can influence education as well as one's worldview. So tonight, I am super excited to be kicking off this series with author, journalist, researcher, screenwriter, the foremost historian of pan, Dr. Kim Johnson. Be sure, come on, like, share the link, get everybody roped in. We have a few seconds and Mr. Johnson will be joining us. But if you don't know, Dr. Johnson has published extensively on the history and culture of Trinidad and Tobago, many of which center around the steel pan. One in particular is his film Pan, Our Music Odyssey, which we at TropicalFete has shown countless times at our classes and our after-school program. But today we'll be focusing on his most recent and in high demand book, The Illustrated Story of Pan, the second edition, a beautifully crafted book that explores the social, cultural, and political history of pan. Not just the physical instrument, but the music, the community, the love, the movement. Not to mention, it's filled with lots of pictures and anecdotes, not only from well-known pan pioneers, but some of the lesser-known persons that are involved in the steel pan. So gather your questions. We want to have a conversation. Like, share, subscribe to TropicalFete, and join in. Mr. Johnson, are you there with us? Okay, so while we wait for Dr. Johnson to join us, I want to encourage you again to share the link, share with your friends, let everybody come in, join in. If you're here, please give us a shout out in the chat, say hi, say good night. Also, TropicalFete, a cultural organization based in Brooklyn. Oh, there he is. Hi, Dr. Johnson. How are you?
I am fine. I'm fine. How
Nice
are
to
you,
see you.
Ashley?
I am fine. I am doing very well. Of course, I have to ask with the COVID and so forth back in Trinidad and Tobago, how is everything down there? How are you? How are your family?
Well, and my family, we are blessed. I've been safe, and I can, I could enjoy the quiet, and and I stay home. Actually, last week I went to Tobago, so I am
Mhm.
one of the fortunate few because a lot of people have it really hard. People who depend on the what they're doing, uh, and they can't do it because of lockdown. They could be in really severe economic problems. So I'm blessed and I appreciate that, but I can't say all is good because for a lot of people, it's really hard.
Yes. Indeed, indeed. And we will, of course, keep them in our prayers and hope that when this is all over, so we could continue jamming and playing some more pan together, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the illustrated story of the steel pan. My question is to you: why take this undertaking? Why? What was it about pan that made you decide to do this? Are you a pan man? Did you play pan growing up? What is it?
No, I didn't play pan growing up. Like every little boy, I pushed pan, that was how little boys were introduced to steel band, back in the 60s and so on. You push pan. I didn't play much later in life. I joined the steel band to learn, but I wasn't able to stay with it because my older daughter was born, and I just couldn't stay away from her. I had to stay home with her on evenings, on weekends, and so on. So it wasn't practical. So how I got into it, it was just kind of fortuitous circumstance. I was a journalist, and my editor said, "Well, why don't you write something about the Bajons for the Sunday Express?" And I thought, someone recommended, we'll talk about some of the old steel band Bajons. So I went very to nearby steel band. That was Tokyo. At the time, it was Carib Tokyo. And, I spoke to the PRO who called in some of the old timers. And I went and spoke with them. And they gave me the most fascinating stories all around Tokyo, that band. So I thought, well, I'd balance it by going to a band in the west of Port of Spain, which was Invaders. And I got like a whole pile of fascinating anecdotes.
Mhm.
And I realized that every band had these stories. So I began going all over. And it was like, as a journalist, as a feature writer, I told stories. And it was as if I'd stumbled into a sort of treasure trove, like this place with just a mountain of diamonds and gems and so on. Because there were such beautiful stories, there were stories of fights, there were jokes, there were stories of love, there were stories of achievements, of inventions. And that, I suppose, I began to write a series a weekly series in the newspaper. And that went on for quite a long time, over a year. And as I collected all of these stories, I realized no one had ever told these stories. No one had ever recommended these men, had ever recognized these men for their great achievements, for what they had done. And that's when the idea of writing a book that would bring together all of those stories first came to me. So that was the beginning of the process. I mean, the process, it went in all sorts of directions. And it just got bigger and bigger. I mean, over the years, I must have interviewed well over 1,000 of these men and women. And every time, I mean, I marvel at them. They grew up under really hard circumstances. They grew up in colonial Trinidad. And some of them were really brilliant, one or two authentic geniuses that, because of where, the time and the place they grew up, there was no avenue for their genius but pan. And they channeled all of this creativity and brilliance into pan. I admired some of these people so tremendously. So I thought, to recognize them, I had to do that. So that's how I got into it.
I mean, the sheer brilliance of all and the collective sort of coming together to bring pan, is not just one person. And I think you really embodied that by interviewing and getting different perspectives from different people and hearing what they brought to the table. That was very interesting.
Well, the thing is, it was a sort of intellectual shift, because up until then, people who wrote about pan, there weren't many, but the people who wrote about pan, generally tended to be academics, and they tended to write about an abstract thing called the Steelband movement, without going into the stories of the different individuals and the different bands. And to me, that was like, it was like writing about jazz and not knowing about Louis Armstrong or Miles Davis or Duke Ellington or any of the great men, just writing about an abstract thing called jazz. But, or, you're writing about rock and roll and you don't know the Beatles. You write about funk and you can't tell the difference between George Clinton and James Brown. It was like that. It seemed to me like crazy. And that's why I did all of that. And because I was a journalist, it was very widely publicized. So it had a very profound impact. I think it really changed how people viewed steel band. Now everyone interviews. I mean, you go on When Steel Talks, you go online and so on. There are lots of interviews. But when I started, there were none. Or rather, there were two interviews. There was one Andy Narell had done with Ellie Manette,
Mm-hmm.
and there was one my editor, Keith Smith, had done with Bertie Marshall. That's it, two interviews. Now there are literally thousands, and you get the full variety. And the fact that the invention of pan was a collective thing. And you have to bear in mind that pan is a word that means different things. Pan is, physical, it's an instrument, the steel pan, but pan is also a genre of music. Pan is also the steel bands, an ensemble. It's a movement, it's like, you might say, the trade union movement or the labor movement or something. So it's a movement as well. And all of those are encompassed in the word pan and the phenomenon that is pan. And no one person did that. It was people of all ages and races and genders and ethnicities um, came together to create this beautiful invention.
We had a question from Mr. Keaton Massa. I think that you really answered that question in your in your response. Is that okay for you, Mr. Massa? That should be fine, right?
If I
Okay,
wanted, I could elaborate a
you
bit
can
on it.
elaborate some more. Yes, go ahead.
Um, the thing is, the instrument that we know today came about through several gradual steps. I mean, was it the first person to beat a piece of metal? Was it the first person who would get two different tones, which are unpitched? I mean, if you drum on it, if you drum on your table, you could get, if you hit the palm and hit the tips, you get different tones.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always that. Was it the first person to get a melody? Now, how it moves from just rhythm to melody is not just like it's playing rhythm now and then it's playing melody. Even that was a series of steps. So, for example, you could play a rhythm with just one tone, or you could play a rhythm with two tones, and you get more tones. And then you play not a melody, but what in music you call an ostinato, which is the same things repeated over and over. That is itself a rhythm, but it's a rhythm based on, say, two or three different tones. So you pass through all of those things before you begin to get a simple melody. So who did the first, of which there are different names that are tossed around. I mean, the most common one is that everyone knows is Spree Simon, but I don't think that's historically accurate. For example, other people who were alive at the time would tend to credit a person many of you may not know, but he's known as Ziggy Lee. Ziggy Lee Constantine when he was in England, and Ziggy Lee Barrow when he was in Trinidad, um, because he played what they call a tenor kittle. They weren't playing melodies yet. A tenor kittle just had three tones. And they played something that was similar to like what a bugle plays. So it would play something, it's a kind of rhythm, but it's more like an ostinato. It goes something like, just like that repeated. It wasn't a melody like you would whistle it or Mary Had a Little Lamb. But there are some of the old timers who credit Ziggy Lee. I prefer to say that around the same time, several people, because there were hundreds of kids doing things, would have come up with this. So I tend to not want to say, well, it's X, but not Y, and so on.
Okay. Do you think that we have done enough? I mean, for me, your book has been a sort of an encyclopedia, I would say, and as opposed to what we have now. Do you think Trinidad and Tobago has done enough in terms of preserving the same history that you have captured here?
No, we haven't done enough, especially insofar as, I mean, I collected a lot of photographs, and now there are even more photographs floating around, like on social media and so
Mm-hmm.
on. But there is no physical archaeology. I mean, there was a collection of some old pans, but I think they got lost between Pan Trinbago and the Ministry of Culture, or whatever. We don't have, even the one is in the works, a carnival museum with a pan exhibit that shows the stages through which the instrument passed. Um, and that's so in terms of the history, people, after I began writing my journalism, people began to collect the oral accounts. So that has been done, and now there are lots of photographs that are being collected and being put on social media. Um, I think there's also a big gap in the analysis, the actual understanding. I think we still have very simplistic ideas of how pan came about. I mean, we still hung up on whether it's Pri Simon or whoever, and we don't see the complexity of the instrument and the complexity of the movement. Um, but that's not a question of not doing enough. That's more a question of perhaps not thinking enough.
Not thinking.
Um, People complain about Trinidadians don't put enough money into it. But if you add up, if you look at the considerable amounts that are put into pan every year in terms of paying panists, putting on Panorama, the large sponsors who sponsor, Renegades, Desperados, All Stars, and so on. The private, the corporate citizens, as well as the small ones. It's a lot of money. It's just I don't know if all of it is spent very wisely. So we've done a lot. We've just not done it, I think, very wisely.
Okay. With respect to the Panorama,
Mm.
I feel like I've heard and I've had certain sentiments where the Panorama may sometimes be looked as doing more bad than good, where the central focus is on the Panorama and not in moving forward and not advancing, when Panorama actually was a sort of a moving forward and advancing at one point in time.
Well, I mean, I suppose there are two sides to that. Yes, Panorama it's comes across as a bad guy very often. A lot steel bands they expand in the carnival season. A lot of people join, and they just learn their Panorama tune, and that's it. You aren't a musician if you could just play one tune, and it's in a sense it's worse when it comes to the junior bands who, instead of learning to be musicians, they learn to play a Panorama tune to play in the junior Panorama and so on. So that's a negative. But the positive is that, I mean, Panorama has helped Pan weather the storm of the fact that a lot of young people are really not interested in Pan. Panorama and the junior steel bands and so on have helped. And in terms of music composition, personally, I regard the Panorama tunes as the power and the glory of Pan. Whatever's your favorite Panorama tune, whether it's Smooth Edwards and All Stars Woman on the bass, to me, Bugsy Sharp, Year of Love, whatever you think. The experience of being in a big steel band and hearing her play a great arrangement. And when I say you don't have to necessarily play, but to be there and the music is surrounding you and there's a movement and there's a vibe. I think that is one of the great experiences of music any human could have. And I think that's a wonderful achievement. And Panorama has done a lot to bring that about. I mean, Panorama, its origins was the first Panorama was 1963. It was a year after we became independent. And it was seen as, celebrating it wasn't designated the national instrument, but it was the national instrument, playing the national music, which was calypso and so on. So it was part of, a sort of political thing almost. And indeed, it wasn't the most popular, and I wrote about this in the book, it wasn't the most popular competition for pan. The most popular was the bomb,
Dom.
the bomb competition, which people loved. I could remember, before I could remember early Panorama experiences, I could remember a very early bomb experience when I heard Ray Holman, and this was quite late, perform um, the Penny Lane for Starlift, and that was like a kind of shock. Um, but Panorama was pushed. Panorama had more financing behind it. But despite those, kind of unsavory beginnings, I think it has done positive things for Pan. Even nowadays, I am kind of I wouldn't say pessimistic, but I'm a realist. And in Trinidad, if you talk to the first 20, say, people who are under 25 years old that you meet, depending on where you meet them, I expect about 18 or 90 of them will say they're not into pan. And even those who they played in school and maybe for a year or two after they left school, they joined a big band. After they get a job or they get a boyfriend, because most are women, they walk away from the panyard and they don't go to Panorama. They don't go back to their panyard ever again. So my prognosis, I mean, I think Pan has tremendous possibility, not just for Trinidad, but for the steel band movement globally. It's a low hanging fruit, but I don't think it's 100% healthy.
You talked a bit about the young people in Pan, and speaking to the younger generation in a certain age group, and they're not that interested in Pan. What a big difference from your book, because most people, as they give their recollection, you hear them say, "I started at 8, 7." Maybe 9, 10, and some of the pictures were filled with young children, and Pan, it was sort of a young people thing.
Yeah.
I would say back in the day, and
But think of hip hop now.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a young American and you're not into hip hop, you're just out of it. You're square. Back in the day, or rock and roll. If you're a young person, I mean, maybe you didn't play, but you had to love it. And a young person in Trinidad had to love pan. As a matter of fact, if a person was humming a tune, I want to hum a tune for you, they would hum it like a pan would play. They would go, you know that tune, and they would hum it as a pan played. That it was so much in our psyche, and that it's not so. Um, so yeah, there's a huge difference, but at the same time, pan has matured in many ways, and I think its potential, as I say, and it's a low-hanging fruit, is just absolutely revolutionary. If they would just open their eyes and see what is there in front of them.
Very, 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 very true. The sort of reminiscing between Pan of yesteryear and Pan of today. So you've had a sort of a bird's eye view of Pan for all these years. So tell me, if you look at Pan now, what is something that you are most proud of? Like, we aren't there yet, but we've moved from the past. And then what is something that you find most disappointing? I think you probably touched on that.
Um, well, as I said earlier, pan
Mm-hmm.
is three things. Pan is a music, pan is an instrument, and pan is a movement, and they're all integrated. In other countries, they aren't so integrated. Um, it's not a movement in other countries. The steel band movement in Trinidad was political. It was not, um, for example, our special works. That's our sort of make work welfare program. That was created by the steel band movement. The first special works projects were done in Laventille and John, and they were administered by the respective steel bands as Desperados and Tokyo. So, I mean, such a rich phenomenon, um, an incredible technical artifact, an amazing, powerful, not just music, but way of making music. You know, the original homemade instrument that we develop our own pedagogy, we develop our own collective way of learning. You learn in the panyard, each one teach one. Um, and this amazing movement, which has become global, we invented that. So even though there are other forms of I would say music of the Black diaspora, I mean, the examples I give, hip hop or reggae or dance hall or jazz or blues or rock and roll or samba. I mean, those are very, very beautiful forms of music that in many ways have been much more widespread, globalized, more popular than Pan. But Pan has a special, I mean, Pan came with an instrument, with a movement, with a pedagogy, with a sort of togetherness. That sets it apart, and that's what I'm most proud about.
Okay. And what are you most disappointed about? What do you miss? What do you think we lost and wish that we could get it again?
Well, when Pan was sort of elbowed off the I've got a question. Okay, I'll answer one and then I'll answer this one. So you'll have to pop this one back up because I'll forget it. I mean, I was fortunate to experience Pan when it was part of Carnival Monday and Tuesday, when Pan ruled the roads. And you had these vast ensembles, and people pushed because it was a pleasure. Even if it didn't pay, it was play. It was a pleasure to be part of this by pushing Pan. And they filled the streets were like huge torrential rivers of music. We don't have that. The closest thing to that is like on the drag before Panorama when the bands are going up on stage and people willing to push it there. But the Panorama before last, I was on the exit of the stage when Renegades came off. And they couldn't get people, even the people who played, to push their own pans back to the panyard. Even the players, you know, were kind of, yeah, and people had say, well, I saw some pans there, and someone had to say, come on, you push that. When I was young, it was a joy, it was a pleasure, it was an honor to push the pan. So that is one of my great disappointments. The question that popped up, could you put it up again? It had to do with the youth. What I would like is for the older generation to give the pan to the younger generation. Now, I'm saying that metaphorically, but also literally. Pan was a young people's thing when it was invented and in its golden years. It was a young people's thing. Now, you know, most of these steel bands are run by, you know, older people. If I were to give you an example, when I was 21 years old, I would not want to be in an organization my father was running. Not because I dislike my father, but you know, when you're young, you want to do your own thing.
Your own thing.
Now, when I say give the instrument to the younger generation, I don't mean necessarily or only give them the organization or give them the instrument physically. I mean, teach them in a way that the instrument becomes theirs to do what they want with. In other words, teach them with the music they like, not what you like. Teach them so that they can play the music they like. That is, they hear a tune, they could figure out how to play it, how to arrange it for a steel band, and how to improvise. Now, the music they like, maybe they like hip hop, and I like soul, or I like calypso. Maybe they like soca, maybe they like dance or whatever. Trust them enough to give them so that they will play the music they like. And I think that is how they will get to love the instrument the way we did, because we played our music, whether it was, the soul music, whether it was the Beatles or the Afro-Cuban music. It was, the music we heard and we loved, and teach them how to play the music they hear and they love, and they will do wonderful things. So I think that is the relationship I would like to see, rather than, I'm old and I'm in charge, so you do this. I mean, my daughter joined Invaders when she was about 14, no, about 13 or so, and they had her playing the William Tell Overture. Now, I don't know how many 13-year-olds will appreciate the William Tell Overture. I like the William Tell Overture, but hey, that is not my music, and that's certainly not a 13-year-old music. So
So
that's a relationship.
in there, I have to ask. I feel like there's sort of a, no, I won't say resistance as a bad word, but sort of a pushback on musical theory. So I understand you kind of saying go towards the trend, go to what the young people like. What about musical theory and the importance of reading music and so forth? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, when people use the phrase music theory, it means different things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
some sometimes it's used as being synonymous with literacy,
Mm-hmm.
i.e., reading, standard literacy on the page. Other times it means the theory of music, the theory of minor scale and a major scale and a minor pentatonic scale and so on. If you use it in terms of reading the standard notation, what I would suggest is that is something that should be taught later on if the person wants to learn it. They shouldn't start with that. And the reason why I say that is, first of all, if you're teaching someone music, there are um, there are three main things you can teach them. You can teach them, you can emphasize one or two, or teach them equally, or in any order. But the three things are, first, um, audiation. That is how to hear a tune and know what is you're hearing. Be able to figure out the chords for the tune, the chord progressions, and so on. That is one thing. We call that audiation. The next thing is improvisation. Um, Improvisation is the ability to jam, basically, and that can be taught to even a relative beginner. And the third thing is literacy. Now, what has happened is that we have tended to see literacy as the sort of be all and end all, and start with that. My argument, and it's based on the experience of a lot of, I mean, I'm talking about generations of Trinidadians, and in particular Trinidad women, who were brought up playing that same literacy on piano. And again, the vast majority, and not just women, a few men, but mainly tend to be mainly women, vast majority, the last lesson was the last day they touched a piano. It made them hate the piano more than anything else. And I wouldn't want that to happen to Pan. Pan is we are very fortunate to have an instrument that is very easy to play.
Mm-hmm.
From the time you're a few years old, you could Pong. With piano, to use your left little finger fast is difficult. If you're playing guitar, you should know to bar a chord
Yeah.
could take you a while,
Mm-hmm.
and your fingertips hurt,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're playing a
Yeah.
steel string guitar. To blow a trumpet, you have to learn to do the lipping, and now you bust up your lip for a long time before you could get a note. Pan, you could, from the first day you're going to Panyard, you could leave there playing a tune. The first day I went into Mary Tunes Panyard, I left there playing the national anthem. So we have this thing. And Pan has taught young people, to play by the pleasure of playing a tune. Don't kill that by sitting them down on a desk with a blackboard. And this is a C here on the stave, and this is a C sharp, and so on. That kills the pleasure. Later on, when they become whatever they decide they want to become, if they may choose to learn literacy, but bear in mind, none of the great popular musicians of the 20th century, whether you're thinking of James Brown or Aretha Franklin or Paul McCartney or John Lennon, none of them were literate in music. That is not how they learned. They learned how the young pan men learned. They learned with their friends. They learned playing the music they loved. So that is the first thing. Now, music theory means another thing. It means, I'm not saying you don't know what's a C sharp, you don't know how to build a chord. Obviously, Boogsy Sharp can't read anything, but you can't tell me Boogsy doesn't know music theory. You can't tell me Paul McCartney doesn't know music. They will tell you, well, yeah, put in a diminished chord here for that and that reason. So that's the overall thing. Now, that being said, I have to qualify it by saying that, you know, pan as you might say, an orchestral music is a lot faster to pass it to a steel band if you could pass them a score. But that is not to replace learning any pan together, because I mean, no lesser person than Andy Narell has said, when you play together is when you get a vibe, and pan is about vibe, you know. So I'm not against literacy. I'm against it being the first thing you're taught. When you're an infant, you learn to speak before you learn to read. If you try to teach a baby to read, you'd be a fool to do that. And recently there's a movement that started in Britain, is beginning to become global, called musical futures. And this was based on studies of how people learn popular music. And the people who learn the way I suggested, learn with their friends, learn audition, learn the music they love. Those are people who play whatever instrument for life. In other words, they learn to love it. The people who learn, you know, kind of going through this thing, doing your scales on your on the sheet music, most of them drop out.
We had a question.
You had about 4 questions.
We had about 4 questions. Yeah. We had about 4 questions, and I want to keep saying them. Yeah, there you go. So Keith Marcel asks, Dr. Johnson, should today, in this era, the administration of Pan Trimbago be done by individuals on the business sector, individuals with business management attributes, no affiliation to any steel band in TNT?
I mean, I think there is a role for people who have business or organizational experience, but that doesn't mean to say you can't be a pan man. In other words, somebody in Pan Trimbago should be affiliated to a steel band somehow. What I would like to see is that people affiliated to steel bands develop business experience, and they are there. I mean, think of Ainsworth Mohammed, who is a very senior person in Republic Bank, and he's the one who's been running Exodus. I mean, people don't realize what a strange thing is this Pan Trimbago. I mean, can you think of another organization that represents an instrument? You know, say of guitars. Is there a guitar association with this sort of power and reach, or a piano or a saxophone association? I mean, but the Steel Band Association, as part of the steel band movement, that's part of our invention, and I would hate to see it just seem to become like, you know, a trade union or a business organization. Besides, I don't think the problems facing Pan Trimbago or the steel band movement, let me forget about Pan Trimbago, because I don't want to go into personality, this one against that one. The steel band movement, the problems it faces are not merely, or not even mainly, business problems. There are problems of music. There are problems of, I think, vision. For example, what I was talking about before, that touches on how do we pass Pan onto the younger generation so that they love Pan. And there are people who see Pan just in terms of a business, how panists could make more money and so on. And I don't think that will solve the problem. I think the problems are not just deeper, but different. what I would like to see is I would like to see every young panist be a musician. And when I say a musician, not a person who I could put a sheet in front of you and you read it. A musician is a person who could understand music. You hear a tune where there's, a piece of funk, a ballad, you like, God forbid, Barry Manilow or whatever, and you could say, well, look, this is what he's doing, and that is what he's doing. And if I were to play it, if I were to arrange it for a steel band, I think I would do this and do that, and maybe I could borrow a bit from this. When Tony Williams arranged the first winning piece from Panorama, I remember he said, one of the things he did, he was listening to a lot of Bach, and he used a descending scale he borrowed from Bach into his arrangement of Dan is the Man.
Dan is the Man. Mm-hmm.
Right. That is musical knowledge. That's musical appreciation, and I would like to see that, and I would like the steel band movement to begin to promote that. And when I talk about the history of pan, you've read the book. I mean, it's a book about the steel pan, but implicit in the book is my understanding, and in a few places quite explicit, of the nature of the beautiful music that the Black diaspora created in the Americas. And when I say Americas, I mean North America, South America, and the Caribbean, of which pan is a part. I would like to see us appreciate and learn from, draw the lessons from, expand on all of this gorgeous, this music, which is the predominant art form of the world in the 20th and 21st century. The great art form that speaks to most people in the world is some form of popular music, which is mainly some music that comes from the Black diaspora. We have created this great, great, wonderful thing, and learn to see it as that. It's not just entertainment. It's not just a way to make $1. It's not just a thing for tourists. It's a thing to survive. It's how people survive the Middle Passage, survive the experience of enslavement, and survive racism, survive colonialism. It's because of that. And now, the interesting thing about this music is that it's like medicine for the soul, and it works. A lot of medicines get really taste bad, and you get an injection, it hurts, and so on. You get your COVID vaccination, and you're sick. This medicine works through pleasure. It's the greatest thing out, and appreciate it for what it is. That's what I would like to see. I went on a bit, sorry.
You speak a bit about survival, and you speak about people being musicians and focusing more and not about money. But I have many friends who I grew up with who are good musicians, good arrangers, and one thing I always hear is, "Girl, I done with that panting. I ain't making no money. I can't survive. I can't live. The pan ain't putting food on the table." So I feel like we still have to have that conversation. Yes, it could be about the love, yes, but we also it needs to be about sustainability, about using your craft and so forth.
Of course, and right now with lockdown, COVID, and so on, all gig workers are suffering. Not just pan. Everyone. So of course, I spoke earlier about the 99% and the 1%, and the 1% has to survive. They each need one another. I'm not saying that, to hell with them. Of course, the 1% needs to survive. They need to put and even if it's just 1%, it is a crucial 1%, because they are the composers, they are the arrangers, they are the tuners, and so on. They are the magicians. So yes, of course they need to survive. What we could do to help them, there are different things. That's a whole next long conversation.
Exactly. I agree. We had another question from Marcia Williams.
what more can Trinidad and Tobago do to export our pan? Um, well, my vision to export Trinidad and Tobago is the mecca of pan. It is the center of pan. I would like Trinidad and Tobago to claim and to claim realistically, not as a delusion. It's a place where I think you will hear the best pan music, you will get the best pan teaching, and you'll buy the best instruments. Now, to me, and I said this before, I think really the power and glory of pan is when you hear and you experience pan in his home. And I'm not even talking mainly about on the Panorama stage. For me, you go in a pan yard or you go on a drag and you're part of the music. That is again, um, it is a really, really glorious spiritual experience of music. And I would tell anyone from wherever in the world, you like pan, you think it sounds nice, you play a little thing and you play a little Panorama tune and so on, and said, okay, that's great. Come to the Mecca. So I would like Trinidad to export pan by claiming and developing itself as I say, the place with the best music, the best teaching, and the best instruments and the best teaching. I mean, who wouldn't love to learn to play pan in Desperados, Panyard, or All Stars, or Phase Two, or Exodus, or Fontclair, or or Cats and Jammers, or whatever? Because it's learning pan is not just learning to play an instrument the way you could learn piano at home with your piano teacher, or learn guitar at home looking at YouTube. Learning to play pan is a social experience. It's an experience of being in a panyard. It's an experience of playing with 70 or 80 or 120 other people. It's an experience of talking with the person who makes your instrument, and talking with the arranger, and so on. That's what learning pan is. It's not just learning notes and learning to perform notes. It's much more than that. And I would like to see that knowledge and that understanding of the spiritual experience of being in a Trinidad steel band. I would like to see that appreciated and that knowledge exported so that people will come to the Mecca. There are a lot of people. I mean, in Trinidad, I meet a lot of people who teach pan at colleges. There, recently I was speaking. I was texting with someone who's teaching pan at Princeton and NYU, um, and he was in phase two. They all know they have to touch base. They all know that. I mean, if you want to learn tango, you go to Argentina. If you want reggae, you go to Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
If you want the blues, you go to New Orleans. I mean, Trinidad has to appreciate and celebrate and develop the fact that if you want pan, you really have to come there.
Agreed, agreed, agreed. So let's go dive into the book a bit. Oh wow. There are tons of beautiful pictures in here. Now, when I grew up and I saw steel pan, I saw pan on a stage. The players were in t-shirts, maybe a little costume, but they were on a stage. Looking through the book, I saw, for example, Silver Stars in a costume on the road, embedded inside the mass. What happened? What happened?
Well, that started in the 1970s. But what happened is that pan was sort of pushed off the road by DJs. A DJ is cheaper. They don't have to stop. Um, they have a wider repertoire. Um, so by the 80s, pan, you was hardly getting pan on the roads. And that's when it began to be sort of corralled into the Panorama reservation. So that's what happened until then. But pan for me is not primarily pan on a stage. Still, even to this day, I mean, the last carnival, which was 2020, um, once carnival season starts, I go to the Panyards. I mean, I live in St. James, so it's very close to phase two. That's the one I go to most commonly. But I will always make sure to drop in Desperados and All Stars and Renegades, which are the tongue bands. Sometimes I may duck into, I mean, at the bottom of the hill where I live, I mean, within hearing distance is Power Stars, you hear them. And when I'm going to and from home, I pass by Tripolians, so I would hear them. And going to a Panyard is that to me is more important than hearing them on stage. That is the closest experience. That and being on the road when they're going to Panorama on the drag, that's the closest experience to what you would have seen in those photographs. And I think that is still the real spiritual experience of Pan. Because it's not just a music like you go to a rock concert or so and it's on stage. No, no, no. Pan is about participation. It's about being there. It's about pushing and shoving and hearing it. I mean, think of it. Think of generally. I mean, there are one, two minor exceptions, but pan panists are the only performing artists who let you in when they're learning their art. You could go in a panyard, they're practicing, they're now learning the tune, they're playing the same few bars over and over and over, and maybe the arrangers now composing the tune.
Really sad. Mm-hmm.
But you could go in there and you're going, and I do it every carnival, every season. You go in there and you lime and you hang about and you chat and you listen. And as the season grows, you see the tune growing,
Mm-hmm.
and it grows on you because it's a complex piece of music. Most people cannot hear a complex piece of music for the first time and appreciate it. And that's part of the genius of Pan. Pan allows you to grow with the music. So all of that is part of what Pan developed. Um, a way of, you might say, elevating the audience even to appreciate what it has on offer. No other performance artist does that. I mean, whether you're a dancer or an actor or a musician, you practice and you rehearse privately and then you come out in public, whether it's for money or for free. But the Pan is different. Pan allows you to be part of it from the beginning. It has always been a people's music, and the people is everyone. And it remains a people's music. And that's so glorious about it. And that's my experience of Pan. Not on a stage as a concert. Not at all.
This is why Pan is described as a community
It,
umbrella of a whole bunch of.
yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we had a question. Trinidad and Tobago needs a proper pan factory, like what exists in countries like Sweden, Japan, and the US. Putting you on the spot here, boy.
Yes. I mean, whether it's a factory or it's tuners or a factory that could build drums, sync them and let the tuners. Yeah, we need something like that. In my book, I mean, they've been making efforts, not all successful, in various programs that would take young people and teach them tuning and so on. And certainly the most successful young tuner, that's Augustus Peters. He passed through that program, but he might be the only one. So yes, we need things to be done. What it is, I don't know. There is the pan factory, Panland. People didn't have a very high regard for their instruments, but that it played an important role because again, it was a step for the young tuner to pass through. Mm-hmm. So yes, things do need to be done. I mean, years ago, I visited Ellie Manette in West Virginia, and he was there at the university, and he had his his room where he made pans, and there were the soundproof room where they would build the pans. So on headphones, once you enter there, you had to put on the noise breakers so that you don't damage your eardrums. And the engineering department had designed special hammers for him and so on. So there was that link between the university and the tuner. In the case of Trinidad, you need a link between where the engineers will work with Butch Kelman, for instance, and with Augustus Peters, and there's that symbiosis. Not just university doing their thing and creating a GPAN on their own and so on. You need to have a more organic relationship, and they've tried that. They have. Bertie Marshall was there for a while. Tony Williams. It just hasn't gelled yet, but so we do need something, but in more detail, I wouldn't venture to say there are people more qualified and experienced who could probably come up with better ideas. Yes, I do think pan is still in danger. In Trinidad, for Panorama, the panists, hundreds of them, thousands of them, are paid. And there are people who play for several bands, under different names and so on. And then they play in large band, and they play in medium band, and they play in small band, and they play in, pan round the neck bands and so on. And it's the same people. And if they weren't paid, they would, that's it. I mean, there are school children who are great panists, and they won't play for their school bands because they're not paid, but they will pay for another band in Panorama because they are paid. And I think the idea of paying everyone is not sustainable. And that's why I say, yes, it is important that professionals, whether you're a professional musician, you have to find a way to earn your living, to put groceries on, and to pay your rent or your mortgage or whatever. But at the same time, it's not sustainable for everyone. If every amateur footballer playing intercol football had to be paid, football would die. So I think, pan is in danger because at present it's not a sustainable situation. And what I propose in terms of education, I think that is the way out, because the idea, as I said before, when people learn what I suggest, when they're taught how I suggest, studies in other countries with other instruments have shown that those become musicians for life. Those became people who love their instrument. And I think we have to bring back the love. There's no way around it. Money will never buy you love, and the money will run out. So yes, it is in danger.
Okay. So I am from Tobago, and as I went through your book, there were little snippets of a little mention of Tobago. I wasn't aware that pan was around in Tobago all back in the 1943s. So my question to you is: have you looked extensively into pan in Tobago in the earlier days?
Not as much as I should have, not as much as I could have. Unfortunately, I mean, I was fortunate to get some great old photographs, but I mean, I went to Tobago once or twice and spoke with some people, but just the sheer amount of time I was able to spend in Trinidad, because I live in Trinidad, I was not able to do that in Tobago. And I mean, I do deeply regret that, and not only because the present president is Tobagonian, but because I'm very much a Trinidad and Tobago partisan, and Tobago has tended to be left out in a lot of things. I was the director of the Carnival Institute of Trinidad and Tobago, and it was like pulling teeth to get people to sponsor me to go to Tobago and develop a relationship with the culture division in Tobago. And things I would like to have done. I would like to have been able to film and record the making of a traditional tambourine and things like that. And I wasn't able to. So, yes, there are things I would like to have been able to do in Tobago. And my main informant was a person, a very eminent Tobagonian who was a very good friend of mine, Eddie Hernandez, who passed some years ago, and he was the one who provided me with the real beautiful photographs of Tobago. And had he survived, I know I would have had so much more, because he was like one of my main informants on Tobago cultural history, and he passed sadly too young.
All right, so I'll be looking out for part 2 featuring Tobago.
Well, let me just show you something. Can you see that photograph?
Yes.
That's Carnival in Scarborough, 1912. So I was 1912. So yes, I collected. I mean, the truth is, a book like the illustrated story, like any story, you have to leave out.
Yeah.
For purposes of telling the story, it's a problem I had, or what people saw as a problem with Pan Odyssey. They say, well, why didn't you have this, or why didn't you mention that one? And you can't. And that is why we need an encyclopedia. Because an encyclopedia with all of the little entries, everybody will get a play. A band existed for just 2 years in Kwaito, they could get a 3-sentence and maybe a picture and so on. So it isn't it doesn't have the demands of a narrative.
Do we have a question?
No, not in other countries. Is Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, I know there was Pan very early on in other Caribbean countries, particularly in Antigua, but that's a whole other thing. Why do people think Pan? The idea that they call it an electronic pan, it isn't really. It's a synthesizer shaped like a pan. You play it, like beating notes in a circular way, but it is a synthesizer. I mean, what is the technology of a pan is how it is tuned and how it is made, and that is what is unique about it. Yes, you're right. A keyboard doesn't replace a piano. I think that idea comes about, has been sort of floating around because of the idea of panists making money. You see, it's not practical to send, it's very expensive to send even 20 people and instruments abroad. So if you could send 5 with amplified instruments, and one thing could sound like a bass, or it could sound like a tenor, or it could sound like a cello, then it becomes viable. And I think that's what they're thinking. But if you see, if you listen, if you recall what I said earlier, I think pan is not just a matter of sound, not just a matter of music. It's a total experience, and the experience is an acoustic experience. It's an experience of being there. It might not be practical, but the truth is, if you've experienced being in the heart of a big band on the drag, no amount of electronic instruments could replace that. I'm sorry, it's just a different thing. It's just like the difference between recorded music and live music.
As we touch a bit on electronics and technology. I have to say, COVID came and everything stopped. And what we love most about Pan, the beauty of enjoying it together and that community, was just went by the wayside. Now, technology, we're going in a technological direction. We have been.
Yeah,
how do you think we have to? How do we compete with that, and how do we let technology work for us and not against us? What do we need to do?
Oh gosh, that's such a difficult question. You are the younger generation. My generation, we are very clumsy when it comes to the technology, but you all live on social media and Instagram and so on, and you all are so wonderful. I mean, I have absolute faith that you would come up with something. But I see Andre White and Sheldon Twist came up. I mean, they have their wonderful podcast, and then there was a Panorama, and so people are doing things as best they could. It's not a replacement, you know. It's like you could talk to someone on WhatsApp or Zoom or whatever and so on, but nothing will replace sitting down in a room with someone, um, hugging them, shaking their hand,
True.
So you can't pretend you'll be able to replace it. You'll do as best you could and try to use what is strong about the technology it is global.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's not live, but let's use its strengths, because it don't make sense dwelling on the weaknesses. It's not the real thing, but it's global. So how can we use the technology to bring the global steel band community together? Because again, Pan is a community, and it's a global community now. That was one of the big differences, I think, between the first edition and the second edition. In the 10 years between the two editions, I became very acutely aware of the extent to which Pan has become a global movement.
Mm-hmm.
And people like yourself, as well as people in Japan and all those high school bands in the States and in Britain, and so they're all part of the steel band movement. They are part of the story of Pan. The story of Pan includes them. As a matter of fact, even though it's in just a sort of in passing in a sentence, even something that is like a cousin, you know what they call the hand pan?
Yes.
Right. That is part of the story of Pan too. It's like a distant cousin, but you have to recognize him. And the the technology that we have been, technological room we've been forced into has that global reach. So it would be great if we could use that to bring the communities together. So when COVID and all the lockdowns lift, we are more tightly knit. We learn more from one another. We appreciate one another, because Pan was always about bringing people together. So let us bring, the Trinidadian, the American, the white, the black, the Japanese, the English. Let Pan be through technology, and Pan bring the world together.
Very well said. Very well said. And I'll take a point from there where you said, you will let the young people handle that sort of a thing, to push and give them the opportunities and let them use what they know to help push it forward and not be held back and not be
No,
held
go
back.
for it. Go for it.
Go
Go
for
for
it.
it.
Go for it. You mentioned the hand pan, and I had a question. You mentioned in the book that the ping pong was originally convex, unlike the pan now, which is concave.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what are the similarities, if you could speak on that, if there are any, other than the shape, between the ping pong and the hang pan?
Well, the the hang pan is based on the very, very complex technology invented to make the pan, which
Mhm.
is the technology of tuning separate notes, and not just notes, but all of the harmonic overtones in the notes, that was developed by Tony Williams, Bertie Marshall, and all the other great tuners. The early um, convex ping pong had none of that. It didn't even have proper pitches. It was just different sounds. Um, it was not. I mean, it wasn't. It's not just it wasn't concert pitch. You did not have proper notes. You can't say, well, that's a
Okay.
C and but that's a C sharp and so on. It was just different sounds.
Okay.
Um, there was a question, but I've forgotten it. My take on the Chipan, well, I'm in favor of the university bringing their technological expertise to pan. I mean, because what is the best kind of steel to use, or the best thickness and the best. I mean that is in their area. That's the area of engineering research and so on. And the GPAN, I remember talking with Brian Copeland, and he was saying ways of getting the skirt to resonate better. He said also, the problem of the high notes on a tenor pan, because they're very small, they aren't very loud, and they were working on ways of improving that. So if that's possible, how those fallen notes in the center of a tenor pan, you could barely hear them. If scientific research can bring that, of course, that would be great. I don't think the GPAN has lived up to its its reputation. I mean, I listened to some of them. In Phase 2 has several, and I if you listen to a band, I mean, Phase 2 is a band I love a lot, but I don't think Phase 2 has the best sounding instruments. I mean, compared with some All Stars and Desperados, I find Phase 2 instruments don't sound as good. But hey, the university, they have their thing to do.
Okay, I think we answered Mr. Cupid question before. Okay, so it's a bit of a tradition here at TropicalFete, where we allow the author to read an excerpt or a portion of the book of your choosing. So if you can please share with the audience a particular section of the book.
Okay. Well, what I will say is how the book is written. Every chapter in the book starts with a large photograph and just about one paragraph that it doesn't summarize the chapter, but it sort of sets the mood of the chapter. So I'll read you one of those, but I'll show you what it looks like. So this is chapter 2. This is what chapter 2 looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you see here is the one paragraph, because the rest of the book is like, normal writing and so on. So I'll just read this paragraph here that introduces the second chapter.
Okay.
Which is called Repercussions. The operative principle underlying the music Africans brought to the New World is that it must help people to live. This is a functional approach to music. It is made to give people strength when they are weak. It must lift their spirits when they are down. With music, people can celebrate the joys of life, and indeed, it is itself one of life's greatest pleasures. Yet, it must also connect people with their ancestors in the land of the dead and with the gods in the heavens above. Most importantly, music must strengthen the bonds between people, because only with and through others do we become fully human. So that is my introduction to the second chapter, where I get into the meat of it. The beginning of how this drum became a melodic instrument. And because of a lot of what we've been talking about, I'll just read the equivalent in the last chapter, Tomorrow's People, i.e. young people. And I say, the future of Pan is not inevitable. It is in our hands, always has been. Before, decisions were instinctual, based on a deep, passionate love, which is always pure. Now, however, Pan is a powerful global movement, and decisions must involve technical, social, educational, and political considerations, which leave them open to bureaucratic caution and conservatism, or worse, to delusion, greed, and influence peddling. Charting the future, the movement must be clear about its challenges, the alienation of youth, of communities, its distance from popular music. And this must recognize its strengths, its entrenchment in our schools, its didactic perfection, and its rootedness in Trinidad and Tobago's soul. Just as 60 years ago, it grew to sing the songs of this land. Now it can teach the world to sing a radically new song. All you need is love.
All you need is love. All you need is love. I love it. I love it. Coincidentally, the first excerpt that you read was one of my favorites. I think it really embodies the past, the present, and the future, and how everything just connects. And it is just wonderful how music helps us all in these times, especially in these times.
No, it's, I mean, if you ever listen to Rudder's song, Engine Room, he says it, there's a part when he says something in the rhythm, just tell you where you're coming from, you know, and the engine room is, he said, this is the heart of it.
Mm-hmm.
It started off as the engine room, and the engine room is, and actually, that's one thing I would suggest when people are teaching pan, and this probably does not apply so much to bands like yours, but it would tend to apply to like high school and college bands. They tend to leave out the rhythm section, the iron and the equivalent of the engine room. But brother was right, the engine, the rhythm, that driving thing, that is the heart of it. Without that, I mean, blow a saxophone or play a guitar, pan, the power um, is that, the same as touch bass always, that is the bass. The iron is the heart of it. If you're iron good, you're king. All the great captains and arrangers played iron. Ellie Manette, Bobby Mohammed, who passed last week. Smooth Edwards plays the bell. Boldface was captain of Renegades. And so powerful it is that engine rooms can exist independent of steel bands. They call them rhythm sections in Trinidad.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start up a rhythm section anywhere, you will see the crowd, and it will still move you as powerfully as the early steel bands. So I think touch base always with your rhythm section, with your rhythm people. People want to be musicians, think they kind of turn up their nose at the rhythm section. It's like the claves in Afro-Cuban music. You think it's just two pieces of wood, but that is, the clave is the Spanish for key, and that's the key that unlocks the rhythm. And the same thing with our iron, our rhythm sections.
Have you published any books or films on the rhythm section?
Not any rhythm section, no.
No? Okay. Was that something maybe you look at in the future?
Well, I'm working on something that would be part of it.
Okay.
But not rhythm section, but on how rhythm works in music, and in particular the rhythm that Africans elaborated, which is very highly syncopated rhythms, and how it affects us. In a way, if we're doing something, if we're lifting something, if we're dancing, when we do it in rhythm, we do it better. It coordinates us. It gives us strength. If you're doing aerobics or you're running or so, if you do it to rhythmic music, you could do more. It literally gives you strength. And the early steel bands knew that. So very often when I would be speaking with the older people, on many, many occasions, someone would say, well, I was waiting to go home in St. James, so I was waiting to go in Diego Martin, and I was waiting on a band to take me. In other words, you have 3 or 4 or 5 miles to walk, and you wait on a steel band because you will go with the band, and those miles will disappear, and they will become a pleasure. You would wish the 5 miles was 7 miles. I don't know if you've ever experienced that when how music and you once you get into the rhythm of the music, things that you're dreading doing become a pleasure. It's what I said
Yep.
earlier. I mean, yeah, the music we developed healed us through pleasure. Um, so it's and the part of it is in particular the rhythm. It's why we dance. You have a great rhythm and you have to move. You snap your fingers or you tap your
Mm-hmm.
feet or you nod your head or so. Um, that's the power of rhythm over us.
Your the film Repercussions, is that
Mm.
somehow connected, related to this idea that we're talking about?
No, no, that film I actually shot that in Nigeria. It had to do with a guy who was trying to develop a steel band movement in Nigeria
Okay.
and so on. I just use the word because, in a sense, is a peculiar thing that the drum came from West Africa, came to here, and now it was going back. So it was a bounce back. It was a repercussion.
Clever, very clever. With that, one question I've got from a lot of people, um, and I'll point to you: drum versus pan, steel
There's
drum versus steel pan. What?
there. Look, a steel drum is a drum made out of steel. You put oil in it, or you put whatever you want in it. A pan is a musical instrument. And as I said before, when we say pan, we use several things. We're talking about a movement, we're talking about music, we're talking about history, a culture, we're talking about a way of making music. Um, a community way of making music. We're talking about a very, very complex thing, a technology that was invented and elaborated in Trinidad for getting notes on discrete notes on a single piece of.
Mhm.
That's a pan. A steel drum is a drum made out of steel. Um, when you say steel pan, it's not two words, it's one word. Now, how the English language works, let me give you an example. If I say, using two words, a blackboard, that's a board, a piece of wood that is black. If I say a blackboard as one word, I'm talking about something that you write with chalk on. And indeed, it doesn't even have to be black. Sometimes it's green and so on, but it is a blackboard is something. It's not a board that is black. It is something that you write on in a school or whatever. Just like a whiteboard and a whiteboard, they're two different things. A steel drum, which is two words, is it's an adjective and a noun. It's a drum made out of steel, and that's all it is. It's like a board that is black. But when I say put it on the blackboard, I'm telling you something. You're in class, and the teacher will write something on the blackboard. So it's not a peculiarity of Trinidadian. That's how the language works. A steel pan, which is one word, steel pan, is something different from a steel pan, which is two words, and it's certainly not a steel drum. So anyone who's equating the two, I mean, they just don't know what is pan, and they don't even know the English language.
Okay. All right. So now, Mr. Johnson, I think we need to wrap up right now. If you have any more questions in the chat, please send them in. Send them in. Let's get our last questions in. In the meantime, can you let us know where we could find your book? Where can we purchase the book?
Well, I mean, if you're in Trinidad and Tobago under lockdown, the bookshop's closed. But I suppose you could inbox me on Facebook, um, or social media or whatever, and if you're in Port-of-Spain or we'll arrange something, right? If you're in the U.S., there's a friend of mine who mails it out. I posted the Santi Manity. It's my blog post. There's a link there where you could buy it through that link, and it will be sent to you on a U.S. Postal Service. You'll get it in about 2 weeks or so. We've had a few mix-up with the addresses, but generally about 2 weeks. And you also have links on, that is, you see santimaniteblog.com /the illustrated story of Pan, which is the one of the drop-down menus on my blog post, which is Santi Manite blog. But there's also the Facebook page, or any of the posts I make. I always put a link to this Santi Manite blog. So yeah, that's where it is. I mean, COVID has really, really affected things badly. And right now I'm trying to not enrich Jeff Bezos even more than he is, right? You'll have to forgive me, but he's a multi-gazillionaire and not a very likable man. So I'm trying hard to not make him even richer. Because when Amazon gets its claws into your product, they take out the bulk, the lion's share of it, yeah. So
Very true, very true. I would probably argue a bit that Amazon is the place people go at first
yes,
to
it
look
is.
for
It
the.
is. It
So
is.
it's a
It is.
give and a take, I guess. A give and a take. Um, any last questions before we go? It doesn't seem like we have any more questions. All right. Thank you so
Ashley,
much.
well, let
Yes.
me ask a question. So,
Yeah.
Ashley, what was it like for you? You've read the book. What struck you about the book?
For me, it was all about. For me personally, I was a bit upset, not of the book, but upset that when I grew up, we weren't taught the things that I'm reading in here. We weren't taught about the impact that Pan had in Trinidad and Tobago. It almost felt as if it was just a pastime. Because when I'm read it, for me, it felt that like it was a pastime. Not downplaying it that much because I didn't really grow up in a pan yard per se. But when I read up people's accounts and how they viewed the movement and how they, I mean, they were badgering, they were fighting each other because they loved this instrument so much. I mean, that love and that competitiveness, I understand what we have now, but for me, it was just, I felt like I missed out in a sort of a way. I wished I was around to experience what was in the book, because I although I love Pan now and I love to be in Panorama and I love the movement, I feel like this would have been a really good experience to see
It
people
was glorious.
loving see
Yes.
people loving Pan, people loving Pan. And you talked about somebody coming and playing Pan and the whole neighborhood coming out to hear what this thing is about, and then somebody else deciding to invent this sort of Pan, steel bands popping up all over the place and just
Yeah, it was hundreds.
I think that love and that drive I would have loved to see.
As a matter of fact, a lot of young boys, before they could go in a steel pan, in a pan yard, they would make little, like small oil tins or grapefruit juice tins, tune a different note on each one and play that before they could get a proper pan. And that was a very, very common thing. In the early days, everyone loved pan. I mean, maybe you couldn't go in a pan yard because your parents disapproved or whatever, but everyone loved pan. And to be, if you want to be macho, you had to be in a steel band. I mean, that was, if you want the girls, have 2 pan sticks in your back pocket.
You touched on the girls, and there's a chapter in the book Women in Steel where you speak about a few of the women bands that came up, and Miss Daisy McLean, and the role that women played, which was varied but very vital. I mean, you hear women weren't allowed to play, and then you see accounts of women hiding and so forth. But then you also see accounts of them being influential in teaching some. teaching other players and arranging even?
Well, the thing is, well, first of all, I think they probably wouldn't have had Pan without women. I mean, they weren't playing in large numbers in the early days, but when it was sort of frowned upon, some woman was letting the boys use her backyard. I mean, the house was always under control of the women, and a steel band without a panya dies, in a matter of weeks. Even today, if a steel band is thrown out of his panya and it doesn't get one right away, it dies. And every steel band owed its existence to some woman who indulged the boys. Yeah, they're making noise, but I'll keep my eye on them. The boys will be boys and so on. So that is the first thing. It would not have existed without that indulgence. When the whole society is saying, nah, stamp it out, that is nonsense, blah, blah, blah. There were women who said, leave the boys alone, I will keep my eye on them. They're just boys, they're just being little, how boys are. So that is the first thing, and that they have to be appreciated because they were the matriarchs of the society, right? Secondly, the boys had no, we spoke about music theory, they had no music theory, they had no music knowledge generally, most of them. And once Pan had begun to develop, um, you know, harmonies and playing, idea of playing in key, and they're trying to develop a chromatic scale and all that. Where are they going to learn these things? This is not things you could learn, just by trial and error. And what happened is, remember I said before, in those days and up until the present, most young women, and not just middle class young women, got some sort of piano lessons, and there were a lot of pianos. So the tuners, very often, the first thing they would tune a note to would be a note on a piano. And if you wanted to learn how to build a chord, or how to do this, or how to harmonize, a soprano voice with a tenor voice or something. So there was somebody aunt or somebody big sister who had a piano and could help you. They all would have had piano lessons. They would have learned classical music, which is still how they teach them. And that's why the first women who were involved in arranging for Pan, they arranged for festival, because that's when they played classical music. The names, you still know the names, the Pat Bishops and the Jocelyn Seeley and the Jocelyn Pear and the Merle Albinos. They were all classically trained, and their brothers were not. So Martin Albino, he played jazz, and he ain't onto this reading thing at all. And but Merle was the one, and they're the ones who became the adjudicators and became the arrangers for festival and so on. And it's much more recently that in large numbers women became panists.
Mm-hmm.
And the large numbers started with birdsong, with the UE band, because they were university students. And then it came in the schools and so on.
Okay, okay. Well, Dr. Johnson, we had a wonderful discussion today. Um, Everyone out there, remember, illustrated story of the pan. You can get it on shopcaribbean.com and also on his website, santimaniteblog.com/ the illustrated story of pan. Next week on Thursday, I'm sorry, we'll be continuing the author series with Kieran Fimber Detterville and author Anselm Douglas. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the
It's
time.
my pleasure.
Thank you for the time to do this book. I know it must have been, a lot of work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
TropicalFete signing off. We leave you with a clip of the TropicalFete Steelpan Ensemble.